I'm Sophie, 26, and if you had asked me a week ago if my family was crazy enough to steal my dog, I would have laughed in your face. But here I am, exhausted, furious, and trying to keep it together after the most insane day of my life. For some background, my Aunt Margaret has always been a problem. She's my mom's older sister, and for as long as I can remember, she's been a master manipulator, the kind of person who never takes responsibility for anything, yet always plays the victim. Growing up, I learned to keep my distance, but that didn't stop her from trying to guilt-trip me into doing favors whenever it suited her. Meanwhile, there's Luna, my golden retriever, my absolute heart. I got her 4 years ago when I was at my lowest. I won't get into details, but she was the one constant that helped me through. She's not just a pet, she's family. I've never met a sweeter, more loyal dog. Aunt Margaret, she has a very different history with animals. She's the kind of person who gets a pet on impulse because it's cute and then loses interest as soon as it becomes an inconvenience. Over the years, I've seen her cycle through dogs, cats, even a rabbit once, each one either abandoned, rehomed, or mysteriously given to a better place whenever she got bored. That alone was enough for me to know I never wanted her near Luna. Now, Aunt Margaret's been living in a rental owned by my uncle, my mom, and Margaret's brother for over a decade. She's always late on rent, but because it's family, he's never kicked her out. She gets away with things because she always pulls the poor me act, and honestly, most people just give in to shut her up. Things boiled over at a family barbecue last weekend. Everything was fine at first, just the usual small talk and overcooked burgers. Then Aunt Margaret cornered me in the kitchen. She had this fake sweet smile and started asking if I was free to watch her grandkids for a few weekends. No mention of payment, just the usual expectation that because we're family, I'd do it for free. I told her I wasn't available. That should have been the end of it. Instead, she flipped. She went on this whole rant about how selfish I was, how I never helped family, and how she always sacrifices for others while I do nothing. I was so caught off guard that I just stood there while she got louder and louder. That's when Luna, who had been lying near my feet, stood up and barked. She wasn't aggressive, she just sensed I was upset. Aunt Margaret recoiled like she'd been personally attacked. "Control your dog," she snapped. "That thing is a menace." I laughed at that because, really, Luna, the gentlest dog ever, was a menace? But I didn't argue. I just picked up Luna's leash and walked away. A few hours later, as people were leaving, I was busy saying goodbye to some relatives when I noticed Aunt Margaret was gone. I didn't think much of it, I was just relieved she had left. Then I got home, and Luna was gone. At first, I thought I was losing it. I checked every room, the backyard, the gate. I called her name over and over, running up and down the street like an idiot. I asked neighbors, checked under cars, nothing. That's when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Maybe you need to learn some respect. Luna will be happier with me anyway." I felt like my brain short-circuited. "Margaret!" She took Luna. I didn't even think. I jumped into my car and drove straight to her rental. I pounded on her door. No answer. I could hear movement inside, but no one came to the door. I yelled through the door, demanding she give Luna back. Nothing. I called my mom, who immediately tried to reason with her. No surprise, Aunt Margaret didn't pick up. At this point, I was shaking with rage. I did the only thing I could think of. I called the police. They showed up pretty fast. But the moment I explained that it was my aunt who took her, their tone changed. They said since it was a family dispute, it was a civil matter, not a criminal one. They suggested I talk it out or take it to small claims court. I was floored. My dog had been stolen, and they were acting like it was a disagreement over borrowed furniture. The moment I got home, I started making calls. First to my uncle, the one who owns the house Aunt Margaret has been living in for over a decade. If anyone had leverage over her, it was him. He picked up almost immediately, and the second I explained what happened, he let out a long sigh. He wasn't surprised. Turns out, Aunt Margaret had caused trouble like this before, though not with a dog. She had a history of borrowing things and refusing to return them, forgetting to pay people back, and creating so much hassle that people eventually gave up. But this was different. This was Luna. He was sympathetic, but there was a problem. Legally, he couldn't just throw her out unless she violated the lease. He needed something concrete, something that gave him an actual reason to start the eviction process. That got me thinking, and I started gathering proof adoption records, vet bills, microchip registration, and years' worth of photos to show. Luna was mine. While I didn't expect things to escalate, I wanted to be prepared if I had to fight for her in court. A friend of mine, whose in-law is in school, suggested small claims court. Technically, I could sue Aunt Margaret for Luna's return, but there was a catch. It could take months, maybe longer. I didn't have months. I knew Aunt Margaret, the longer she had Luna, the more likely she was to give her away just to spite me. That's when I decided to go to her house. I parked a little down the street, watching. The blinds were shut, the house dark. I waited, hoping maybe I'd hear a bark, see movement in the backyard. Nothing. It was like she knew I'd be coming and was keeping Luna hidden. Then a neighbor, an older woman walking her own dog, stopped by. She noticed me staring at the house and casually asked if I was looking for someone. I explained the situation carefully, making it sound more like a misunderstanding than a full-blown theft. She didn't hesitate. She had seen Aunt Margaret bringing a dog inside earlier that day. That was all I needed to hear. I went back to my car, mind racing. If she was keeping Luna inside, I needed something to force her hand. That's when I remembered something, the lease agreement. Aunt Margaret wasn't allowed to have pets in the rental. My uncle had always been firm about it, too many issues with damages in the past, and now she had my dog inside that house, violating her lease. I called my uncle back, laying it out for him. He didn't like it one bit. She had already been pushing her luck with late rent payments, and now she was breaking the lease entirely. That wasn't even the worst of it. The same neighbor who saw her with Luna also let it slip that Aunt Margaret had been secretly renting out a spare room without my uncle's permission. That was it. My uncle had enough. He told me he'd start the eviction process immediately, but wouldn't say anything just yet. The last thing we wanted was for Aunt Margaret to panic and do something reckless. While he handled that, I filed another police report, this time emphasizing that Luna was taken without my consent. I made sure they had a record of my proof, and while they still called it a civil dispute, at least there was official documentation. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. Aunt Margaret. I picked up, and before I could say a word, she was already yelling, furious that I had snitched to the family, that I had no right to go after her like this, and that I was blowing things out of proportion. I let her talk. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, I gave her one chance. I told her to return Luna, no more games, no more stunts. Just bring her back, and I'd walk away. She laughed. Actually laughed. Then she said the most infuriating thing I'd ever heard. According to her, Luna was happier with her. Luna loved her more, and she was keeping her for Luna's own good. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about taking Luna. This was about control. She wasn't going to give her back, not willingly, so I stopped wasting my breath. It was time to take things to the next level. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. No more wasting time. No more dead ends. I needed an actual legal strategy. The consultation was quick, but clear. Since I had overwhelming proof that Luna was mine, adoption papers, vet records, photos spanning years, I had the legal right to reclaim her. The lawyer laid out my options. I could take it to civil court, but that would take time, or I could apply even more pressure and force Aunt Margaret into a corner. I chose the second option. Before I did anything else, I made sure everyone knew what was happening. I shared a post about the situation on social media, using no dramatic language, just a straightforward explanation. I didn't even have to tag anyone, and the post quickly spread. Mutual family members, friends, even people who barely knew us started sharing it. Comments flooded in. Some people were furious on my behalf. Others were just shocked Aunt Margaret had stooped so low. The reaction wasn't just online. Aunt Margaret's own children saw the post. I don't talk to them much, but they started questioning their mother directly. It was one thing to steal my dog. It was another for her own kids to call her out on it. Instead of backing down, Aunt Margaret doubled down. She went on the defensive, claiming I was harassing her, that I was turning family against her over a misunderstanding. Then she started blocking anyone who confronted her, including some of our own relatives. The more she pushed back, the more obvious it became that she knew she was in the wrong. While that was happening, my uncle took the next step. He officially served Aunt Margaret with a violation notice for having an unauthorized pet and for illegally subletting a room in the house. The clock was ticking. She had to get rid of Luna or face eviction. I wasn't going to wait for her to come to her senses. That night, I decided to take another drive by her house. I parked further down the street and walked along the sidewalk, trying to stay out of sight. From behind a gap in the fence, I saw Luna sitting near the porch, looking toward the house like she was waiting for me. I took clear, time-stamped photos as evidence that Luna was inside Margaret's property. I wasn't alone this time. Either one of my friends had come with me. A witness. With that, I called animal control. I reported that my stolen dog was being kept at that house. It was one thing for the police to call it a civil matter, animal control. That was different. They arrived the next afternoon. I wasn't there in person. I didn't want to give Margaret the chance to twist things into a confrontation, but I got a call from my uncle just minutes after animal control showed up. Margaret was panicking. They asked her to provide proof of ownership. She had none, no adoption papers, no vet records, no microchip registration, nothing. And the best part? She didn't know what to say. First, she tried claiming Luna was a gift. When that didn't work, she tried saying I abandoned her. The officers weren't buying it. Then the police got involved. Animal control had escalated it, and this time the officers took it seriously. They gave Margaret an ultimatum: provide legitimate proof that Luna was hers or surrender her. Margaret had nothing, no way out, and she knew it. That's when my phone rang. Margaret. I picked up, and before I could say a word, she was screaming, furious that I had gone this far, that I was turning the law against her, that I was trying to ruin her life over a dog. I didn't argue. I didn't yell back. I just let her talk. Then I told her the truth. This wasn't about a dog. This was about her thinking she could take whatever she wanted, manipulate whoever she wanted, and get away with it. I gave her one last warning: return Luna, or the next step would be legal action. She hung up. The police gave her 24 hours to provide proof or surrender Luna. Meanwhile, my uncle moved forward with the eviction. Margaret hadn't just broken one rule. She had broken multiple: late rent, unauthorized pets, illegal subletting. The notice was signed. She was on borrowed time. Some family members took my side immediately. Others, not so much. The usual guilt-tripping started. She's family. It's just a dog. Can't you just let her keep Luna? I ignored every single one because, at the end of the day, Luna wasn't just a dog. She was mine. And no matter what Margaret pulled next, she wasn't getting away with it. The deadline passed. Aunt Margaret had failed to provide proof of ownership, no adoption papers, no vet records, because there were none. She had nothing. That morning, an officer from Animal Control contacted me. Since Aunt Margaret couldn't prove Luna was hers, they were escalating the case. Now it wasn't just a civil matter, it was being treated as theft. The officer assured me that legal action was now possible. Minutes later, the police followed up one final warning. Aunt Margaret was told she had to surrender Luna immediately or face legal consequences. There was no more room for arguments, no more stalling. But instead of complying, she played the victim. She started ranting about how I was bullying an old woman, that I was trying to ruin her life over a dog. that I was turning the whole family against her. She even accused the police of taking my side unfairly. Meanwhile, my uncle had officially had enough. That same afternoon, he contacted his lawyer and initiated the formal eviction process. No more warnings. Aunt Margaret's time in that house was coming to an end. Then things took a turn, a very bad turn. That night, instead of surrendering Luna, Aunt Margaret secretly moved her. I woke up the next morning to a new problem. Aunt Margaret had changed her story. When the police followed up to take Luna, she was gone. Aunt Margaret now claimed that I had given Luna to her willingly, but was now having second thoughts. I knew what she had done. She had sent Luna away, but to where? Panic set in. I spent the entire morning calling every local shelter, rescue, and veterinarian I could find. I told them to be on alert for a golden retriever who might be brought in under suspicious circumstances. Then, a breakthrough. A neighbor down the street had a doorbell camera. When I explained the situation, they were more than happy to check the footage. And there it was, clear as day, Margaret's son loading Luna into a car the night before animal control arrived. With proof in hand, I went straight to him. I tracked him down at his house, banged on his door, and waited. He answered, nervous, shifting on his feet. Guilty. I demanded to know where Luna was. He wouldn't say. He stammered, avoided eye contact. I didn't waste time arguing. I made it clear, in front of his neighbors, that if Luna wasn't returned, I would press charges. This wasn't a family argument anymore. This was pet theft, and I had video evidence. The pressure was working. Aunt Margaret, sensing that she was losing control of the situation, changed her story again. Now she claimed that Luna was at a friend's house for a few days. No names, no locations, just another stall tactic, another attempt to throw me off. I called everyone in the family who was on my side. No more letting Margaret lie her way out of this. If she wouldn't admit the truth, we'd force it out of her. That was when I got the final piece of the puzzle. One of Aunt Margaret's own grandchildren slipped up, completely unaware of what was happening. They casually mentioned that Luna was at Grandma's friend's house in another town. I didn't wait. I drove straight there. This time, I brought the police. We arrived at the address, some random house in a quiet neighborhood. In the backyard, tied to a post, confused and scared, was Luna. The homeowners acted clueless. They claimed they didn't know the dog was stolen, that a family friend had just asked them to keep her for a while. But I had everything: proof, reports, video footage. The police stepped in. Luna was coming home. The moment Luna was back in my arms, I felt her whole body relax. She was confused, tired, and slightly dehydrated, but otherwise okay. I held onto her tightly as the officers wrapped things up. The homeowners kept insisting they had no idea she was stolen, but it didn't matter. They weren't the ones who mattered. Aunt Margaret had run out of excuses. I wasted no time. The next stop was the veterinarian's office. I needed to make sure Luna was completely fine after everything she had been through. A full checkup confirmed she was healthy, just slightly dehydrated and a little anxious. The vet suggested keeping a close eye on her for the next few days, making sure she had plenty of water and reassurance, as if I was going to leave her side after all of this. Then came the next call from the police. Since Aunt Margaret had not only refused to return Luna, but had also lied to authorities and moved her to avoid getting caught, the case was being escalated. There was no immediate arrest, but she was officially being warned that legal action was being taken against her. If she kept pushing, this would turn into actual charges. Instead of backing down, Aunt Margaret went on Facebook and lost her mind. She posted a long, dramatic rant about how I had destroyed her life over a dog and how family should never do this to each other. She painted herself as a helpless old woman who was being bullied by her own niece, completely ignoring the fact that she stole my dog. The comments? A disaster. Some people actually defended her, but most called her out immediately. My social media post had already made the rounds, and people knew the truth. Friends, extended family members, Even some of her friends started turning against her. Meanwhile, my uncle made his move. The official 30-day eviction notice was served. No more warnings, no more leniency because she was family. She had violated the lease multiple times, and now she was out. That should have been the end of it, but Aunt Margaret wasn't done. Instead of accepting the eviction, she went to the media. She contacted a local news station, telling them she was being unfairly evicted by family and had nowhere to go. She spun a whole sob story, hoping to gain public sympathy. But when reporters dug deeper, her entire plan backfired. They found her history of neglecting pets. They found out about the illegal subletting. They found multiple complaints from neighbors about her causing problems over the years. The whole thing flipped on her. No one bought her Victim Act anymore. As her support crumbled, the extended family split in two. Some relatives completely cut her off, realizing just how manipulative she had been. Others still tried guilt-tripping me. I started getting calls from distant relatives saying things like, "She's still family, and you already got your dog back, can't you just let this go?" Absolutely not. Then her son called the same one who helped her hide Luna. He was furious, accusing me of taking things too far, that I had ruined her life over a mistake, that I should have just worked things out privately. I didn't even argue. I hung up and blocked him. Then came the voicemail. Margaret left me a nasty, unhinged message. She called me ungrateful, accused me of being brainwashed by outsiders, and threatened to take me to court. It was full of rage, threats, and delusions. I played it for the police. Their advice? Get a restraining order if she continued harassing me. I had every right to take further legal action. Meanwhile, her living situation collapsed. Because she had been illegally subletting, the person she was renting to was also kicked out. She had nowhere to go, and now she had two people scrambling for housing instead of just one. People started distancing themselves from her. Friends who once supported her saw the truth. She was burning bridges left and right. Then came her final plea. I woke up to a long text message, a desperate one. She asked me to drop everything, to forgive her, to let her stay with me. She was begging now, saying she had nowhere to go, that she had always loved me, that she only wanted what was best. I only sent one reply: no, find somewhere else. Now, with the eviction countdown ticking, she's out of options. But I know one thing for sure: she won't go down without another fight. Aunt Margaret wasn't done yet. Even with her eviction date set and most of the family distancing themselves, she was still grasping at anything she could to stall the inevitable. She filed a formal complaint against my uncle, her landlord, claiming she was being evicted unfairly. She tried to argue that this was all personal retaliation, that she was being punished because of our family feud over Luna. The complaint was shut down immediately. My uncle's lawyer shredded her argument with documented proof of her lease violations, late rent, unauthorized subletting, breaking the no pets policy. There was no gray area. She had no case. That didn't stop her from throwing another public tantrum. She went online again, this time targeting my uncle. She called him a traitor to family and claimed he was trying to make her homeless over a small misunderstanding. Then she threatened to sue him for emotional damages. Nobody bought it. By now, almost everyone knew the full story. She had burned too many bridges. People ignored her or mocked her in the comments. The more she tried to get sympathy, the more people saw through her lies. That's when she started reaching out to distant relatives. She called up old family members she hadn't spoken to in years, begging for help. Most of them either ignored her or told her outright that they wanted nothing to do with this mess. The few who were tempted to take her side backed off once they heard the actual details. When that failed, she tried guilt-tripping my mother. She called her, crying about how I was ripping our family apart and how my mother should step in and fix things. My mother refused. She told Aunt Margaret that she had done this to herself, that she had taken things too far, and that there was nothing left to fix. That was the last straw for Margaret. The begging turned into threats. She started sending angry messages to me directly. At first, it was more of the same pleading, guilt-tripping, trying to make me feel bad. But when I didn't respond, it escalated. She threatened to ruin my reputation, telling me that if I didn't help her, she'd make sure I regretted it. She sent messages implying she would make things difficult for me in ways she didn't even explain. I had enough. I filed for a restraining order. It wasn't just about the harassment, the voicemail, the threats, the manipulation, it was all on record. The moment the restraining order was filed, she was legally banned from contacting me in any way. At the same time, my uncle discovered one last violation. Margaret was trying to sneak in another tenant, despite already being evicted. She was still trying to rent out a room for extra cash. That was the final straw. My uncle's lawyer immediately filed for an emergency eviction order, meaning she could be removed even sooner. That's when things got really desperate. Margaret tried to force her way back into the house. The locks had been changed, and she wasn't allowed inside, but she still showed up and tried to get in. She pounded on the door, screaming, demanding to be let in. The police were called. When officers arrived, they warned her she was trespassing and that if she continued, she'd be arrested on the spot. She finally backed off, but not before swearing that this wasn't over. Her final attempt to stall the eviction was downright ridiculous. She suddenly claimed that my uncle had gifted the property to her years ago. She faked old text messages to try and prove it, but the messages were obviously altered. The landlord's legal team immediately debunked her lies with proper ownership documents. With no options left, a court date was scheduled for her forcible removal, and then she vanished. Instead of showing up to court, she fled the city. She packed up in the middle of the night and left, abandoning the rental completely. But she didn't leave it in good condition. She trashed the place before disappearing. When my uncle inspected the house, it was a disaster: holes in the walls, stolen appliances, destroyed furniture. She had left a complete mess. Now, instead of just an eviction, my uncle was suing her for damages. The cost of repairs was thousands of dollars, and since she was already struggling financially, this was going to follow her for a long time. With an eviction on her record, bad credit, and lawsuits coming her way, she found herself unable to rent another place easily. No landlord wanted to take on someone with a history of eviction and property damage. She burned every bridge she had left. Aunt Margaret's downfall was well underway. After fleeing town to avoid eviction, she struggled to find stable housing. At first, she bounced between distant relatives and old friends, relying on the same sob story how she had been forced out and betrayed by family. But her reputation had already caught up with her. Most people had already heard the truth. Some let her crash for a night or two, but once they saw the full picture, her eviction, the lawsuit, the destruction she left behind, they stopped answering her calls. One by one, the doors closed on her. Meanwhile, the eviction was finalized. The court officially ruled in favor of my uncle, meaning Margaret now had a formal eviction on her record. No more legal loopholes, no more stalling. This made it nearly impossible for her to rent another place. Then came the financial consequences. With a lawsuit for property damages active, Margaret owed thousands of dollars for the destruction she caused to the rental home. And since she never showed up to fight the case, the court automatically ruled against her. She was legally responsible for paying every cent. I made one final move. I blocked her everywhere: phone, email, social media. I was done giving her any access to my life. My mother did the same, refusing to engage with Margaret's manipulations any longer. She had burned every last bridge with us. Even the family members who had originally defended her started distancing themselves. The moment they realized she had lied the entire time, they went quiet. No apologies, no admitting they were wrong, just silence. She had played the victim for so long that when the truth finally came out, nobody wanted to be associated with her. Then, out of nowhere, Margaret's son reached out to me. After weeks of avoiding contact, he finally sent me a message. He admitted that Margaret had pressured him into helping her, that she had manipulated him just like she had manipulated everyone else. He said he had nearly lost relationships with other family members because of her lies. He regretted everything, and most importantly, he told me he was cutting ties with her for good. It didn't change what he did, but I could tell he was serious. Even her own son wanted nothing to do with her anymore. With Luna finally home for good, things started settling down. At first, she was still anxious and disoriented, especially at night. But slowly, with enough love and patience, she began to relax. She followed me around everywhere, never letting me out of her sight. But the moment I saw her wag her tail like she used to, I knew she was healing. But Margaret? She wasn't done embarrassing herself. In one last desperate attempt to get revenge, she went online again. This time, she played the ultimate victim, claiming she was forced out of her home and betrayed by family. She made it sound like she had been abandoned with nowhere to go, leaving out the small details like, stealing my dog, destroying the house, and lying to the police. It didn't work. Most people already knew the truth. A handful of distant enablers took her side at first, but even they eventually grew tired of her endless drama. At this point, the restraining order was finalized. Margaret was now legally banned from contacting me in any way. No more phone calls, no more threats, no more guilt tripping. If she tried anything, she'd be arrested. As for the lawsuit, it only got worse for her. Since she ignored every court notice, my uncle was awarded full damages, every single dollar in repairs she had to pay. And since she was already struggling financially, this was another nail in the coffin. Meanwhile, my uncle won in the end. With Margaret gone, he renovated the house, fixed the damage, and rented it out to someone much more responsible. No more drama, no more late rent, no more chaos. He officially closed the chapter on Margaret's tenancy. By now, her reputation was in shambles. The story spread through family and friends. Nobody wanted anything to do with her. A few distant relatives still entertained her sob stories, but even they eventually got sick of her constant demands. With an eviction on her record, a lawsuit against her, and no stable housing, Margaret was running out of options. She bounced between cheap motels and reluctant friends' couches, but no one was willing to take her in long term. She had no stable income, no real support system, and no way to fix the mess she had created. And honestly, she had done it all to herself. As for me, I was finally free. Luna was safe. Margaret was out of my life. No more toxic family drama. No more manipulation. No more stress. Looking back, I had zero regrets. Margaret made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences.